Game 2 of the Women's World Cup final. Humpy Koneru, 38 years old, the finest woman player ever to come out of India, against dynamic Divya Deshmukh, the 19-year-old, who's looking really strong. Game 1 was drawn, but Divya missed a fantastic chance to put that game away. Let's see what happened in Game 2. So Humpy plays knight f3. Now she is the more solid of the two players. Very, very experienced. And she started out with a reti. It's almost like wait and see. What's Divya going to throw at me? And we're transposing into something that's, well, very classical, very solid. A6 from Divya. Well, this is a well-known move in this kind of position. Black often wants to take on c4 and then play b5 and bishop b7. Also, if the bishop comes to d6, then it prevents knight b5. So b3, that means that white can always recapture with the pawn. And of course, the bishop prepares to come to the long diagonal, the fianchetto. c5. So Divya playing classical chess, occupying the centre with pawns. Now at this moment, it could be that black is getting close to threatening to play d4. So that's why white exchanges and plays d4. So this is a very well-known position, actually. So they've arrived at a Queen's Gambit, Tarrasch variation. Very classical, because very often you get positions with an isolated queen's pawn if there's an exchange here. Bishop g4 played. Okay, the standard move, just putting some pressure here, and that means there's a bit more pressure here. Bishop e2 breaks the pin. Classical development. Now it's possible to play bishop d6 here, and then we get our isolated queen's pawn position. And I think that kind of quite straightforward position probably suits Humpy. Divya instead just exchanged on f3 and exchanged on d4. Okay, it's also a very standard way of playing. And then bishop b4. So yes, black has given up a bishop for a knight, but it's meant that Divya could exchange on d4, so that pawn now blocks the bishop. Castles from Humpy and an exchange on c3, not letting that knight get away. So if black had castled here, then there is the possibility to perhaps play knight a4 and knight c5. So that's why the exchange of bishop for knight took place here. So we've got an intriguing position where Humpy has two bishops against Divya's two knights. Well, who's better here? Who does that favour? Well, as I mentioned before, this bishop is blocked in by the pawn on d4. If that bishop could somehow get on the other side of that pawn on f4 or g5, well, that would be quite an interesting position. But, that pawn could come under fire as well. So it's not easy for that bishop to gain its freedom. In the meantime, black might want to put a knight to the outpost on e4, and that would be quite pleasant. So although rook e1, good move, covering the e4 outpost. So yes, although theoretically you might say, well, the two bishops should be stronger than the two knights. With the closed centre, in fact, it's not so clear, and this is quite dynamic. Could slip to the advantage of either player, actually. Queen d7, yep. Good developments, connecting the rooks. Queen's on a good square. h3 and h6. So both players solve that back rank problem. In fact, there's a previous game that's been played up to this point between Nakamura and Carlsen. There we go. Two players who really know what they're doing. And Carlsen exchanged all the rooks. And Nakamura played bishop d2 and then knight e4. Position was about equal. The game eventually ended in a draw. But both sides have chances here. It's not so dry with the balance of bishops against knights. But Divya played, instead of exchanging straight away, h6, just solving the back rank problem. And then rook c1. And at this point, Divya exchanged all the rooks. So you could say she's gained a tempo over that other game because h6 has been included. But it doesn't make too much difference to the assessment of the position. Queen f5 from Humpy. Okay, the queen very active. Of course, g6 not possible because the knight is hanging. And a solid reaction from Divya, queen e6. So if the queens are exchanged, then that pawn supports the pawn on d5. That would give the knight some freedom. It's still roughly level. But Humpy wants to keep the queens on. Queen f4. And that gave a chance for Divya to throw the knight in on the outpost on e4. So at the moment, yeah, I have to say I quite like Black's setup. Divya is set up very well indeed. The knight hitting the bishop. You know, Black could even start to take the initiative in this kind of position. Okay, let's have a think and drink moment. So it's white to play. Humpy playing white. How would you play here? Cheers, white to play. Well, if white isn't careful, then black could take the initiative. So, for example, if this bishop nudges back to b2, let's say knight g5. So that looks at this important piece. Bishop g4, bishop moves, but then a check. And the queen shifts over here. Well, this is starting to look very interesting. Certainly very double-edged. I mean, white is not out of it yet. But white has to be careful. So Humpy played instead bishop takes knight. So with this, she's actually fighting for the initiative. So if queen takes, then this endgame is actually very nice for white. This knight has to go back to, well, if it goes back to d8, then bishop a5 actually traps the knight. Well, it can be saved like this, but white, obviously a pawn up, should be winning. And if knight b8 and g4, that's a nice move. So this pawn is looking isolated, and very soon that king can just walk into the center and, you know, hassle the pawn. So white is better there. So that's why pawn takes bishop was played. Now, if queen g3, threatening something like d5, then queen d5, and that's a good blockade. Again, this bishop is not looking great on c3, with the pawn blocking it on d4. So that's why, after the bishop exchange for the knight, Humpy played d5. Really dynamic move, opening up the bishop's diagonal. And then queen g4. Now, black has to be quite careful here, looking at this pawn. g6, stopping the mate. Queen c8 check. So be careful, king h7, queen h8 mate. So the knight went back to d8. Now, it's not possible to move the bishop in straight away. Of course, it would be very nice if white could win the pin knight, but then queen d1. Queen d6, check, picks up the bishop. For that reason, instead of bishop f6, Humpy played Queen b8, covering that diagonal. So after the check, the king plays to h2, and there's no check on the diagonal. So obviously bishop f6 is a threat now. So Queen g5. Remember, white is a pawn down here, but with the bishop on this diagonal, the queen very active, the knight passive, then obviously white has excellent compensation. But can you break black's defense? Okay, Queen c1 check is threatened, picking up the bishop. So bishop d4, and it also guards f2. And there's a threat to play bishop b6, hitting the knight. So that's why king h7 was played. And bishop b6 is possible. This wasn't played. And then queen takes b7. But actually, black has pretty serious counterplay on the king side. It's a tricky position, you know, with this knight potentially coming into g5. I mean, it's always said that queen and knight can be a potent attacking force. And that could well be the case here. You know, in a way, white would very much like to exchange queens and then try to use the queenside pawn majority, but not possible here. So queen c7, the queen comes back, keeps an eye on the pawn on f7. Obviously stops queen c1 check as well. Queen d5 hits the bishop. And, you know, white has a few interesting possibilities here. I mean, one is to play the bishop back to b2 with the idea of queen c3, attacking on this diagonal. But actually, knight c6 is a good move. And let's say queen b7. Now, excellent idea. Don't check here, because after g3, actually white is doing very well. The king is safe enough. But first, I mean, this is typical of the kind of tricks in this position. e3. Give up that pawn, and then you start checking. And in this case, well, I mean, there's clearly no possibility for white to guard with g3 because the second rank is open, and yeah, obviously black is fine there. It'll be a draw. And yeah, if king f2, in fact, the king just doesn't escape. Black just keeps checking. And so on. So yes, the obvious try, or the crude try, with bishop b2 and queen c3 doesn't work. So Humpy played bishop b6, attacking the knight, which moved to c6. Queen b7. So Humpy has the pawn back, but these pieces are now too far away to protect the king. And after queen d1, the king had to go to h2. Queen d6. Now, do you play for a win with g3 or put the king back on g1 and repeat the position? Well, if g3, then knight e5. And this is obviously very, very dangerous. And queen e4 isn't possible because of queen b6. And, well, that's already better for black. Yeah, this is way too dangerous for white to contemplate. King g2, queen d3, you know, this could be very tricky. So after queen d6, Humpy played the king back to g1. Divya checked on g1. Divya checked on d1. King h2, queen d6, check. King g1, queen d1. So they repeated the position 3 times, and that was a draw. So the second classical game drawn in this final. Tense game. I mean, it certainly had its moments. I think, you know, if you're just looking at it from the outside, it might not seem that a huge amount took place. But, you know, both players really took their time And it was quite tricky after this move knight e4. And very interesting try from Humpy to give up a pawn to open up this diagonal. Very tricky position indeed, but well negotiated by both players. So, 2 draws. They now go into rapid play tie breaks. There'll be 2 rapid play games tomorrow, Monday. I think it's an earlier starting time. I need to check that. But I'll report back at some moment and let you know how they get on. 2 rapid play games, and then if they're drawn or it's 1-1, then the time control gets faster and faster. Oh, and I should mention to patrons that the next Patreon broadcast will take place on Thursday, the 21st of August. I'll be looking at anti-Sicilians. So if you've got any questions about anti-Sicilians, then do write into me. So that broadcast exclusively for patrons. If you haven't subscribed to Patreon yet, then do check out the link and hopefully see you at that broadcast.